Welcome everyone to today's episode of In My Shoes. This episode is in honor of International Day for the Commemoration for Victims of the Holocaust, which will be on January 27th. My name's Dana Summerstein. I am a partner here in the real estate and banking and finance group of Greenspoon Marder, and I am honored to be your guest host today. For those who may not be as familiar, the Holocaust ended about 75 years ago, and every day we have fewer and fewer survivors remaining. So it's so important to remember what it was. And as the saying goes, if anything can, it is memory that will save humanity. So I'm so honored that I've got two of my colleagues here today who are willing to share their story of the subjugation, deportation, and execution that occurred of millions of people in Europe, a majority of those being of Jewish descent. It's really important for those who are listening that we're going to be bringing up memories and upbringing that may not have been informed by this awful part of our shared history. And so we'll be talking about items that will be sensitive today on this episode. So please remember to be respectful and kind towards each other as we learn what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. So as I said, I'm lucky today to be joined here by two guests. We've got Gerry Greenspoon and Lindsay Miller. And if his last name didn't give it away, Gerry is also the co-founder of Greenspoon Marder, and our co-managing director is joining us today in honor of his parents who are Holocaust survivors. Now, Lindsay is a senior paralegal in our International Asset Wealth and Planning Group in the Miami office, and she's joining us today in honor of her grandmother, who is a Holocaust survivor. Thank you both again for being here.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start, we've talked about this is a very difficult and personal story that you're sharing with us today, but it's so important. And I'd like to give you both an opportunity to talk about the people that you're here, or the person that you're here honoring today. So Lindsay, if you want to start.
Absolutely. So both of my grandparents actually were Holocaust survivors. Today I'm honoring Gerson and Anna Wegner, who survived the fires of Auschwitz and many other camps during Nazi occupation in World War II. My grandparents were resilient and relentless, and throughout our lives growing up, it was very important for them to teach us the understanding and the importance of Judaism and to keep the faith, even though they went through treacherous experiences as Jews. The surviving of those experiences is what kept them going strong and taught us to just keep our culture and traditions and love for Judaism close. And because of that, it's important for me to carry on their traditions and faith and honor them in situations like today. And I'm thankful for the opportunity that we're here talking about these experiences, because of course, our primary purpose is to keep the tradition and religion alive without allowing history to repeat itself.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing their names.
That's one of the critical takeaways that we have, is that we must keep this memory alive and never forget. It's one of our greatest and strongest mottos. It keeps driving us. It drives us in our outlook on life and in our charitable envisions. Never forget. It's for that reason that the Jewish population and even the world's population have created so many memorials to those who were killed during the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, of the 6 million others that were just exterminated by the Nazi regime. We cannot ever let that be forgotten. So we work especially hard in creating these memorials and passing them on to the children. I'm a direct descendant of Holocaust survivors. My parents, my mom Sonia, my dad Adam, were in Poland at the time the war broke out. And Poland was a very early on, back in 1939, invaded by the Nazis and taken over, and Jewish people were just arrested and either kept in ghettos, right, contained many cities, or sent to labor camps. It was a horrific experience Each one of my parents were actually very young. My mom, I think, was about probably 11 or 12 years old when the war broke out. My dad maybe more around 16, 17 years old at the time, and they did not know each other back then. They were just kids in different cities in Poland. My mom's and the experiences were very different, but typical of so many others. My mom's family split up. She had a brother and actually don't even recall. There were other members of the family. Specifically, she went with her brother and her father kept them basically in hiding in Poland throughout the war. They were able to stay or hide with other families out in the countryside, almost in like an area of a farmland area, very isolated, but in hiding and in constant fear of being found out. They were like that pretty much throughout the war. They split from their mom went in a different direction with my mom's sisters, who I never got to meet. They perished at some point. I don't even know their entire story, but they perished at some point in the Holocaust. That would have been my grandmother and aunts from my mom's side. My mom, while staying with her dad and brother, survived, except adding even more tragedy to the story. Just towards actually the end of the war, my mom's younger brother stepped out, actually, just kind of stepped out as a kid. He was a young kid and just stepped out to play in the area. And just right at that time, a group of Nazi troops were coming through and spotted him and just shot him dead. And this occurred actually right in front of the eyes of my grandfather. Anyhow, they did survive, but just the two of them. They were the only ones who survived from my mom's family, and were still in Poland at the end of the war. My dad, on the other hand, he lived in a larger. My mom was from a very small town. My dad lived in a much larger city, which it's a very large city in Poland, and as it is today, a city called Lodz. But they took all the Jewish people, and they put them all together in an area into a ghetto area. So my dad was living and survived most of the war in the ghetto, and that probably for about 3 or 4 years. My dad was very he was very resourceful and was able to kind of get in and out of the ghetto, was able to find food and bring it back in, and actually was able to hold a position of, even as a very young person, just late teenage years, really 18, 19, barely 20, not even 20, and hold the position of authority and survived with his younger brother, my uncle. They survived that way in the ghetto. It was obviously it's very, very difficult living. Until at one point they disbanded the ghettos, which is probably around 1943 or so. At which point my dad and his brother, both of them, were kind of taken to forced labor camps and different concentration camps, and they were just kind of moved around. Extremely lucky to survive. Jewish people were continuing to be killed and exterminated all over, and they were just lucky they and survived the war that way, having been moved around camp to camp, and at the end they were liberated from a labor camp. I guess to put that story together, my mom and dad met after the war in 1945. The war ended, I think, around May of 1945. Later that year, my parents actually they met through. My dad was kind of it was kind of a mess. It was just a mad zone. It was and a free for all. But my dad was extremely resourceful, and he was a merchant, like trading. He would go around and go even crossing borders and getting goods and merchandise to sell, to buy and sell and trade. it turns out that my grandfather, who survived the war with my mom, as I said earlier, he was doing the same thing. So my father and my grandfather met at some point in 1945, and my grandfather, he kind of liked my dad. My dad was a very good looking guy, actually blonde hair, blue eyes, a really handsome guy. And my grandfather goes up to him, pulls out a picture and says, "This is my daughter. I want you to come home with me. You're going to meet my daughter." And they did meet, and they fell in love, and they got married, and they lived for a little bit in Poland after the war. Poland still remained a very treacherous area. It was pretty much a lot of chaos. The Jewish people's property, who had been taken from them at the beginning of the war, and now Jewish people were coming back to regain or retake their property, but obviously Polish citizens had taken over the property, so it remained an extremely dangerous situation. And so they left Poland, and they moved to other parts of Europe until they were able to immigrate to Canada in 1949. So the overall experience, as you can imagine, was horrific. I can't even imagine. None of us can ever imagine. None of us can ever put ourselves in the shoes of those who actually went through it. To us, it's just a story. They say it does create a tremendous burden on the next generation, after the survivors being mine, that we actually live with guilt about how that even occurred, and what happened, and what our parents had to go through. So it's an extremely emotional subject for us who are the first generation descendants of survivors, but at the same time gives us a burden to know and feel and encourage us that we must carry on the memories. We must work very hard to make sure that this never happens again. We must educate as many people as possible. The education and the stories are critical, and that is just a duty that we all have to take. It can happen again. Terrible things go on in the world today. People are killed every day, still today. The world doesn't change much, but there are mostly good people in the world. But there are still bad. There are bad creatures that exist, and it's the role of all of us, especially as Americans, who truly enjoy freedom like possibly nowhere else in the world. We probably have the greatest responsibility to make sure that situations like happened in the Holocaust can never happen again.
Absolutely, Gerry. And I love the story of your parents meeting. I think it's such a nice light in otherwise a very dark and horrific time for our history. And obviously you share a lot of the attributes of your parents and their resilience. And it's a beautiful story to tell. And, I had the experience of going on the March of the Living when I was a senior in high school. And it's not the same as being a first generation descendant, but you're there with survivors in Poland at the camps, hearing that story. And what you hit on, I think really resonates, that there are not as many survivors anymore. And we are those people that now, if you have met a survivor or have heard someone like Gerry and Lindsay today sharing their story, you now carry that burden of sharing those memories, of telling that story. And hopefully those listening today will take that with them and will be able to share it forward. And Lindsay, I'd love to offer you the opportunity as well to share a little bit of your grandparents' story during the Holocaust.
Absolutely. Gerry touched a little bit on the subject and the demographic for me as well. My grandmother, both of my grandparents were from Poland, and my grandmother was also from Lodz. After the war, a large percentage of the Jewish population resided in Lodz before the war, and then they were ultimately nearly completely wiped out. When we talk about the war growing up, it was very difficult for my grandparents to relive those moments and those. So their responsibility and their duty to passing along the stories in the very beginning, at least when they left that to schooling and education and really. I went to private Jewish school because for them it was important for me to be fully immersed in the culture. Where they didn't want to concentrate on being victims, and they were proud and strong survivors, but they never treated themselves as victims. And I think that's one of the best characteristics that I have from them today, is that we are products of this surviving, of being survivors, and that passing that along and living with that strength is something that gives us endurance every day. But and back in 1939, say September 1st was when the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler made his first speech, basically declaring war on Poland. And not far after that, my grandparents were just removed from their homes in the middle of the night. My great grandfather was a shoemaker, and he was a businessman, and he worked very closely with a lot of the Germans. And they would spend their summers in Switzerland, and they got their machines from Switzerland, and they had a very good life in Germany. And they were globe trotters, if you will. They were businessmen, they were successful. And when I asked my grandmother, if you had resources and you knew that this was happening and you saw that there was an invasion and that Nazi Germany was taking over, I asked her, why didn't they decide to get up and leave if they had the opportunity? My grandmother was a child of 7. One of her older sisters had left pre-war to do fashion in Paris. And when you think about the opportunity that some people had to get up and leave prior to the war, you question why they didn't just leave. And my grandmother tells me of the stories how her father sat at the dinner table and, became irate at the thought of having to uproot his life and his family and his business in the face of anti-Semitism. And he refused to leave his land and his home and the life that he built for himself to succumb to the pressures of hate. At the end, it was just greater than one person alone. Obviously, no one knew what would come about after this speech and after the declaration of war. But from the eyes of my grandparents, my great grandparents, he refused to understand that it was kind of happening, and he wanted to stand his ground, and he insisted that he did business with the Germans, that they knew him, that they would be okay, because he knew that he was intertwined in the lives with the same people that ultimately was the demise to all Jewish people. And so as hard as it is to think about the change in trajectory that would have occurred had my family left, there's also some dignity in standing your ground and being a strong, it's to a fault, obviously, just because the rise of the Reich was just so powerful, and there was no way to get around it at that time. But just there's such dignity and strength in, I can imagine my grandmother describing my grandfather pounding his fist at the table and refusing to leave because he was just a man of dignity, strength. And ultimately, short after that September 1939 invasion, unfortunately, my grandparents were ripped out of their homes in Lodz, in the middle of the night. And my grandmother realized what was according to my great grandmother, her mother realized what was going on, and saw that right away everyone was being separated by their ability. Either you were useful to the Germans or you were not, and your usefulness was dependent upon your strength, your ability to work, your age, your mental capacity. And my grandmother, as a young child, she was about 14 when war was first announced and they were taken from their homes. Her mother, right away, they were separated in gender, and her mother realized that they were also separating the old from the old from the young, and the weak from the unhealthy. And it was at that time that my grandmother latched on to her mother, not wanting to be separated. And, you know, in our eyes, we believe that my great grandmother saved her daughter's life by pushing her into the line of healthy people. And it's unimaginable to think that you'll be ripped from your homes in the middle of the night and you'll never see your family again. Excuse me. It's hard to think about it and think about the pain that they went through, and then the beauty of the survival and the life that they made for themselves after. But nevertheless, that was the last time that my grandmother ever saw her mother. And she never saw her father and brothers and sisters again, except for those that survived after the war. And there were two that survived. So we were lucky enough to have them be reunited. But, you know, after that time, my grandmother was sent to a work camp. And she tells me about the first time that she got to this camp. And there were rumors about what was happening to Jews. And they saw the terrors in the streets, you know, just being basically mass moved into these work camps, into the ghettos, away from their families. My grandmother was working for an ammunition factory. But before she knew where she was being placed, they talk about being transported to the camps. And my grandmother tells this just horrific story about the things that they knew and that they heard from people around the ghetto or around the camps. And, you know, word traveled fast when people were in fear and when people were having certain experiences. Word of mouth was the best and only way they passed information, if not through notes. But, you know, verbal telling of the stories was how the people around the camps and ghettos were hearing of what was happening. And my grandmother talks about getting to the first camp and knowing that, hearing the stories of the chambers, you know, they were heard very early on where people were gassed in these gas chambers. And she talks about this terrifying moment where she went into the camps and everyone started panicking because they put them in a large room and they thought that they were going to be gassed. So just this, not only the physical torture that they endured, but just this mental torture at that moment from the very beginning, thinking that their lives were going to be taken from them in these gas chambers. And she's describing the horrific screams and terrors of people trying to climb. And if the gas wasn't killing them, the despair and of trying to escape from the chambers and trying to get as high as they possibly could, thinking that gas was going to come in through through these shower looking outlets. And the first thing it would do would go, it's heavy. Gas first goes to the bottom and then it rises. So before anything even happened, everyone's climbing and trampling over each other, just trying to save their own lives at the expense of anyone and everyone that was around them. And that was the kind of notion of survival of the fittest in the war, unfortunately. And fortunately for my grandmother, that moment in time and the rest of those people were spared because they were actually just put in those rooms to take showers. And it was not long thereafter that everyone was stripped of their dignity and their personables. As you may or may not know, glasses were taken away, clothing was taken away, identity was taken away, not only in a physical sense, because your clothing was torn away, you had to be identified by a yellow star on your clothing, but your name was taken away, your identity was taken away, and in that you're stripped of your dignity, because now you get the Holocaust, everyone in the Holocaust, and my grandmother's no exception, were identified by tattoos and numbers on their arms. And in Judaism, our body is our temple. We don't mark our bodies. And it was almost like a sense of we're sacrificial lambs in here, where they were sacrificing their religion and their livelihood, because a lot of Jews, even if you're not very religious, we're strong cultural traditional Jews, and to mark our bodies by force was just being stripped of your dignity in any way without choice. And I just remember my grandmother would tell me the stories of how, she didn't understand. So there was this moment of fear when she thought that she was going to be gassed. And then that moment never was really relieved throughout the times in the camps. And it was confusing for her because as a young girl, she needed to use her imagination to survive. I mean, we were talking dead winter, the harsh winters where everyone would be marched around in the snow, absolutely naked, just for health checks to see if they were strong enough to work, because you were nothing but, you weren't human, you were a machine. And if you couldn't provide work, then you were useless. And my grandmother used to tell me how she survived these moments where she would see people just be shot and killed in front of her for just being weak. And they're living off bread and water and barely any nutrients, but they're being touted around as if they have to be, strength. They're trying to convince their strength in order to survive. And she told me how creative that she needed to get during the war, and that her imagination and her belief was the only thing that kept her going. And every time someone would get shot in front of her, she would look at the blood and she would pretend like they were roses. And they were the only white dots in the snow. And in order for her to survive, she had to rely on her imagination to believe that she would be able to one day get out of there. And so it's beauty in this treachery, because at the very end of the war, my grandmother always had these rose bushes, and she would, every morning she would take us out and look at these rose bushes and how high they are and how strong they are. And I never really understood the significance of how important that beauty was to her, because it was actually what kept her alive during the war. And there were so many times that she needed to use her imagination. She told me one time that she was walking down the stairs in the camp, and that the commander's daughter was wearing her clothing. And for her, she was suppressed as a child. She was her childhood, whereas she was stripped of her childhood. And here is the commander's daughter living through her own childhood. She's seeing that right in front of her, but she kept going, and she was strong and resilient, and she was resourceful. Like Gerry said, his father was resourceful. They didn't have a choice during that time. They had to be resourceful. She worked in the kitchen, and she would tell me how she would kind of smuggle beets out of the kitchen and throw them over the fence to people that she knew from the neighborhood or in the war. There was another time where, desperate for food, she was an opportunist. Potatoes fell off the wagon coming in. She ran out of line to get potatoes for her and the people and the rest of her bunks. And she was attacked by a shepherd, and she, always had this scar. And for her, these physical wounds were just as significant as the emotional wounds that she experienced. And those were the physical signs that we saw, because her telling her stories growing up, as I mentioned, were very difficult for her. And we learned a lot through documentaries, which many times we would watch, and they would see themselves in the documentaries. And at the very end, she told me that, after hearing everything, everyone, typhoid fever was a common sickness back during that time. And my grandmother caught typhoid fever during the war, and she went under the bunks, and she stayed there for what she thought was weeks. And she said she finally had this dream at the very end of her grandmother telling her, her mother, my great grandmother, telling her, you have to wake up, you have to be strong. And, whether it was this constant use of imagination that came in through her subconscious in a dream, or in just this hallucinogenic state because she was so sick and the fever was taking over, it was that sign or that imagination or that moment, whatever it was, that she had to find deep inside. And she says that in this dream, or in this happening, my great grandmother squeezed orange juice in from her, and she always, it's so vivid, the way she describes it, and the way that she describes it is clearly the way that she saw it. And it was so vivid to her. And you felt how vivid it was in the way that she described her mother squeezing this orange into her mouth just for some strength. And it was at that moment that she came out and realized that she had to be strong for her family and for everyone. And she came out from under the bunk, and everyone was scared because they thought that they had seen a ghost, because she had disappeared and they thought that she died. And unfortunately, they turned her own bunkmates turned against her, because everyone lived in fear at the time. And they turned her into the commander, and they turned her in and she had to go to the clinic. And during that time, believe it or not, the one thing that was a rule was basically you can't be hung twice. And anyone that was in the clinic was set to be sent out to be lined up and shot, because at that point you were of no use. So my grandmother tells us of that time where she went from having the fever into the clinic because now all of a sudden she was of no use. And they lined them up, and the commander came, and she describes the way you heard his boots coming, and they were ready to be lined up and shot by artillery. And at that point, the commander got a phone call, and someone comes running in and says, Commander, you have a call. You have to take this call. You have to take this call. And just by the luck of it, he left and he took the call. And the next commander in line came in and said, well, now's your chance. If you can walk out of here, you better go now. And she ran out of there. She told me that she crawled out of there. And that was another point of survival for her. So there were so many times during the war where she fought for her survival, and she refused to succumb to this hatred and this rise against the Jews, and more than the Jews, but anyone that Blacks and gays and gypsies and anyone else that was part of this group of hatred. And at the very end, she finally told me that it was the North Star that saved her. When the Russians came to liberate the camps, she was in the middle of being sent to a different camp, and she heard the bombs, and eventually the Germans opened the door and abandoned the trains. And she told me that they were just so exhausted and tired of fighting. And her friend fell asleep on her shoulder. But at the very end, when it was time to be liberated, they opened the doors and they say, that's it, the war is over, the Russians are here. And she's hearing this, and she's it's describing how elated she was, and hurry, it's time to go. And her friend had never made it. She died on her shoulder. And it was that moment that my grandmother, it was the last time that she had to fight for her survival, and it was time for her to escape. And she did. She said she followed the North Star. She found the closest farm. And thank God she was helped by some Dutch people who had a farm. She couldn't tell you where she was. And eventually the Red Cross came and overheard her saying, someone in line overheard her saying in her last name. And she said, come with me. I have someone to show you. And she was liberated with her sister, who didn't even recognize each other at the time. So they were hard stories to tell and hard to listen to. And I think Gerry touched on it as well. The guilt, my mother really experienced the firsthand generational guilt because it was very difficult to live with Holocaust survivors. My grandparents for a moment forgot, lost faith when it was over, lost faith in humanity, in the basic humanitarian needs that we all need to survive. These inherent belief in love and faith in humanity and togetherness, in belief in even God, questioning his ability, why every Jew went through this and why families were taken away and how he could let this happen. And so rebuilding that, I think, took a lifetime. And my mother was a person of guilt It was very difficult for her to be raised by two people that were rebuilding the basic human beliefs like love and trust and just overall goodness in the world. And, thank God it was the resilience that allowed my grandparents to overcome that time in their life. And they finally met, and they came in through on December 24th. They came in through New Orleans, and the port was closed. So they had a moment where they heard about all the boats being turned around from Ellis Island. And they obviously didn't know, being Jews, that the ports were closed on Christmas Eve. And so they thought that they were being turned around. My mom was born in Germany. So they came, it was just them. And my mom only with literally one diaper and shirts on their back was the only thing. And they came and they made a life for themselves. And so, here we are today. It's important for us, of course, to tell these stories, as hard as it is. You mentioned how long it's been. It's crazy to believe that it's been 70 years. But at the end, when they tried to go back to their homes and their families, they had nothing. Their neighbors answered their door and said, get out. What are you doing here? This isn't yours anymore. And instead of living their lives as victims in that capacity, they built a new life. And here we are. It's now up to us to recognize the fact that they went through these treacherous fires and these horrific moments just for being a Jew. And so here we are with the burden, the duty, and the responsibility and the honor to carry on these stories so that we understand that we can never let it happen again. So thank you for letting me share that.
Lindsay reminds me of another issue that that comes up, and people ask me, and I know many others, what was it like in your home, in my home, me as a child growing up? My parents, remember, as a little kid, my parents were just out of Europe. It was very, very fresh memory. They had just left that horrific experience just a few years previously. And then I was born in Montreal, Canada. And what kind of experience did you have in your house? So the answer to that is that there are kind of two different ways that in general, that this seems to have been handled by survivors particularly coming to North America, Canada, or the US. And in one type of household, which seems to be a little bit more apropos for Lindsay's experience, your ancestors talked a lot about their experience, and were open about it, and were free about it, about what they went through, and for the purpose of they wanted their children and grandchildren to truly understand what had happened for a good reason, and for the purpose of understanding and making sure that this is never forgotten. On the other hand, there were some other households, like mine in particular, was actually the opposite. It was not spoken about. It wasn't hidden, but it was just not spoken about. It was, you're here in a new country, in a new home. You're making a new life for yourself, and you're moving forward. What happened, and now we move forward. Cannot change what happened. We will never forget. We will remember. We will discuss it if asked. But otherwise, we are just marching forward, creating a new home. We don't want to put any additional burden on our children, even though it's felt automatically. It doesn't matter. They couldn't help that. That happens by itself. So there was very little discussion unless we as children asked something specific. But interestingly, it was too difficult for me, actually. I couldn't ask the questions. I didn't want to hear anymore. But my children, and they became, say, young teenagers and older, they asked the questions. They asked the questions that I could not bring myself to ask of my parents. And my parents did respond. I learned more then. already a dad myself, all right, that's when I really learned all of the detail of what had occurred to my parents. Just kind of eavesdropping on their conversations to discover it. And it was because some just had the need to talk, and others said, not necessary. We just need to move on. We're making a new home. We were integrating with our new society, our new culture. We don't want to have any bitterness towards anybody. We want to move forward, and speaking to their children and grandchildren, we want you all to move forward, integrate with wherever you are, be successful, be part of the community, be part of your new community, be strong, be educated, work hard, just the simple basic things, which is so important to the Jewish culture, but it's so important. Most of America pretty much gets that. That's just the way we are. So it's very interesting to hear Lindsay's version of the situation.
No, I agree. I think it's nothing short of a miracle, right, that your families have survived, and to come out of such unimaginable cruelty. Gerry, I think to your point, it's incredible the capacity of humanity to forgive, or to be able to move on with love, with strength, to create a life for next generations to come. And that is what both of your families have done. And it's a painful question to ask, but I know it's something that we've talked about, that in this current climate, we are seeing a rise in hate again. We're seeing a rise in hate generally, and we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism specifically. And so I wanted to ask each of you, coming from the experiences, the family that you have, having experienced in generationally such hate in the world, coming through it with love and humanity, do you have any advice for the world and for the people that are listening on this podcast for how we should be facing this anti-Semitism today?
That's why our role in preserving the memory through memorials and museums, again, going back to the statement, never forget. People forget too easily. Way too easily. It's very convenient. Very convenient to forget bad situations, bad times. It's almost hard to believe, but it's all true. So we must work even harder in maintaining the memory, keeping it at the forefront. It's very disturbing to see the rise in anti-Semitism. There's unfortunately, historically, the Jewish people have been a scapegoat going back thousands of years to civilization. I cannot answer why, but it's a fact. But that doesn't stop anything or anybody. It just makes us work harder and be more determined in working towards erasing racism and prejudice, because we have felt it as Jewish people our entire lives. We know what it's like, and so we want to work harder to teach anybody that we can how deserving, what a disservice that is to society, how detrimental it is. And so we do the opposite. We become so embracive and welcoming of all forms of other cultures for that purpose. So we need to work harder.
Thank you. Lindsay, anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for younger generations, it's hard to see because even in the, more reform sector, without going off on a tangent too much about Israel, after the war, we formed the nation, the state of Israel. And it's hard for me to understand. And I'm such a supporter of Israel just because we know that if anything, if there's any such anti-Semitism that will rise to the degree of Nazi Germany, we know that we have a safe haven, and Israel gives the Jews this safe haven where all the other countries turned Jews away. And to see the rise in anti-Semitism against such a fractional portion of people, I think we're at 1%, we're 3% or so of the population, and to have to
that's in America.
Right.
In America. Yeah.
The world population, you're 0.3%, maybe. It's minuscule.
And still being used as a scapegoat, and there's still a lot of anti-Semitism. So it's something that it's hard for me to understand, but supporting the state of Israel and supporting equality, and even and you know, there will never be peace there, it doesn't seem, because we just can't reach a solution. But to just lead with love and acceptance and understanding, exactly what Gerry said, is a way for us to hope that others will lead with love and openness and understanding towards us, because we are human like everyone else. You know, we're all the same. We all just do our best to survive, to be the best people that we could be. And the anti-Semitism just puts up this huge roadblock, and it creates a wedge in between different types of people. So I think Gerry hit the nail on the head by saying that we need to lead with love and openness and understanding, in hopes that we in turn are accepted for who we are. And you know, I don't know whether or not they'll ever be, but I see anti-Semitism within the sector itself, where our, you know, we're even fighting amongst ourselves about the existence of Israel and Jews in non-religious sectors versus more religious sectors. And you know, I wish I had an answer for it, but continuing to be part of these discussions and support groups, and, you know, groups like the Jewish Foundation or Jewish community centers, where it's just teaching togetherness and a voice for Jews around the world. I think it's the best way to kind of stand up and promote acceptance. And I think if we lead with acceptance, the hope is that eventually others will lead with acceptance as well.
Yeah, and Lindsay, I was really struck with part of your story, that your great-grandfather sitting at the table banging his fist, saying, why should I have to leave? This is my home, right? And I agree. It's amazing that Israel's there to be open and as a safe place. But I'm really struck with the rise in anti-Semitism, that this is our home, and why should we have to leave, right? And I agree. I think sharing the memories, sharing stories like we are today. I know Gerry's very involved with the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center here in Broward County. I think resources like that, museums, more education, hopefully will help us combat against this rise that we're seeing in anti-Semitism and also in hate. So I want to really thank you both for being here and for sharing. This is the hard work, but really meaningful work, to begin to continue to repair and to remind people of the atrocities that happened. There's a saying that all Jews were victims, but not all victims were Jews. And certainly the stories and the lessons from the Holocaust can be shared with everyone across the country, across the world, no matter your background or where you came from, or if you have a specific connection or a loved one who was impacted by the Holocaust. We all are impacted by the Holocaust. And I think we can hopefully walk away from this with these lessons learned as we help inform the world and combat racism and bullying and stereotyping and anti-Semitism. So thank you both for taking the time today. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. It was awesome. Thank you.
Take care.